Moscow, late 1978. This was the pulsating epicenter of the Soviet Empire, arguably the most heavily monitored square mileage on the entire planet. Every cobblestone seemed to have ears, and every dark window concealed a lens. In this city, the Committee for State Security exercised a level of control that bordered on the absolute. From the deep labyrinths of the metro to the vast, windswept avenues, the state's invisible grip was felt by every citizen and guest. Foreigners existed in a gilded cage of perpetual scrutiny. Their apartment walls were lined with microphones, their telephone lines were merely extensions of recording rooms, and every movement was shadowed by silent observers. It was an environment of brutal consequences. A single indiscreet remark or a suspicious meeting could result in an immediate expulsion or a permanent disappearance into the depths of the Soviet prison system. Yet, incredibly, one operative from the United States managed to navigate this minefield for 6 consecutive years. He operated in the lion's den without ever being compromised or detected by the watchful eyes of the center. He wasn't a phantom, but he possessed the discipline to move like one. This is the remarkable chronicle of an academic who became the most effective American intelligence asset to ever walk the streets of the Soviet capital. Our narrative shifts from the frozen streets of Moscow to the sterile, high-security corridors of Langley, Virginia. It is 1976, and the Central Intelligence Agency is searching for a very specific type of weapon. Jack Morrison was an anomaly in the world of espionage. He was not a hardened commando, nor did he come from a long lineage of military officers. He was a man of books, a respected professor of Russian prose at Georgetown. However, Morrison possessed a rare gift that the agency considered more valuable than any weapon. He spoke Russian with a native's intuition, mastering not just the grammar, but the gritty, authentic, street dialect of the working class. He possessed a profound grasp of the Slavic soul, understanding the dark humor, the cultural taboos, and the subtle nuances of how people actually communicated when they thought no one was listening to their whispers. The global stakes were escalating rapidly. The Soviet Union's recent military intervention in Afghanistan had pushed the Cold War to a dangerous fever pitch, and Washington was starving for reliable eyes inside the Kremlin. The recruitment began not in a secret bunker, but during a routine faculty gathering. A soft-spoken man in a professional gray suit approached Morrison, offering a conversation over coffee that would change the course of his life. The pitch was devoid of cinematic flair. The agency didn't need a soldier, they needed a quiet observer who could seamlessly blend into the gray, bureaucratic fabric of the Soviet system and listen to its heartbeat. Morrison was initially resistant. He enjoyed a tranquil, prestigious life with a devoted wife and a young daughter. The prospect of trading his safety for a life of high-stakes deception seemed like an impossible sacrifice. But the recruiter understood the professor's moral compass. He spoke of the terrifying proximity of nuclear conflict and the desperate need to prevent a Third World War through accurate, human-sourced intelligence. He argued that Morrison's unique linguistic abilities were the only key to piercing the Iron Curtain. His skills weren't just academic, they were potentially the only thing standing between global peace and total annihilation. It required 3 months of soul-searching and countless late-night discussions. Ultimately, the scholar decided that he could no longer remain a bystander in the face of such overwhelming historical necessity. His specialized training commenced immediately. It was a grueling curriculum focused on real-world tradecraft, the art of detecting surveillance, the science of dead drops, and the psychological mastery of the double life. The most vital lesson was also the most difficult, the cardinal rule of deep cover. Morrison was instructed that he must never, under any circumstances, break his persona. His character had to become his new reality. For half a year, he prepared his mind and his cover story. By the time he was ready, he was no longer just a professor, he was a carefully constructed ghost, ready to be haunted by the secret police of a superpower. In the dead of January 1978, Jack Morrison finally stepped onto Soviet soil. The climate was a physical assault, a frigid wall of -20 degrees Celsius that seemed to crystallize the very breath inside his lungs. He stood on the tarmac, surrounded by the oppressive silence of a Moscow winter, realizing that his secret life had officially begun. Sheremetyevo Airport appeared as a monument to monochrome. Every surface was a different shade of industrial gray, the concrete slabs of the runway, the heavy winter sky, and the somber wool coats of the weary travelers. There was an undeniable weight to the atmosphere, a pervasive sense of being watched by an unseen, monolithic entity. At the customs desk, a stone-faced officer examined Jack's passport with agonizing slowness. He turned every page as if searching for a microscopic flaw, his eyes darting between the document and Jack's face. The officer fired off a series of sharp questions in Russian, testing for any hesitation. Jack responded with a calm, polite, and flawless accent. The official eventually pressed the entry stamp into the passport and gestured for Jack to proceed. An embassy vehicle was waiting outside the terminal to transport him to his new life. As the car pulled away, Jack looked into the side mirror. A black Volga sedan immediately fell into line behind them. It was a silent, permanent reminder of the KGB's presence. The American embassy stood as a yellow-walled fortress on Tchaikovsky Street. Within those stone boundaries lay a few acres of American territory, but outside those gates, the world was entirely under the control of the adversary. Jack understood that every step he took across that threshold was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of survival. Jack's assigned living quarters were modest, a two-room apartment with a utilitarian kitchen. From his window, he could observe the agents of the state sitting in parked cars, their silhouettes barely visible through the frost on their windshields. They were there when he went to sleep, and they were still there when the pale sun rose over the city. His first week was dedicated to orientation and the subtle protocol of diplomatic life. He met his colleagues, most of whom viewed him as just another low-level cultural officer. They had no inkling that the man teaching them about Russian poetry was a deep-cover operative. Only the station chief was permitted to know the truth of his presence. The station chief, Richard Carter, was a veteran of the intelligence wars who had spent 3 grueling years in the capital. He was a man who looked older than his 50 years, his face etched with the exhaustion of constant vigilance. Carter led Jack into a specially shielded room, a sanctuary of silence designed to defeat even the most advanced bugs. Inside the secure room, the low hum of white noise machines filled the air. Carter leaned back, his voice low and urgent. "You must assume that the walls of your home have ears and the streets have eyes," he warned. The KGB has invested decades into perfecting the art of surveillance. They have informants in every shop and microphones in every lamp. Carter defined the mission with brutal clarity. Jack was to live his cover to the point of absolute boredom. He was to teach English, organize film screenings, and socialize with Soviet citizens. But his true objective was to identify the cracks in the system, the scientists, officers, and bureaucrats who were willing to trade state secrets. "Always remember," Carter said, leaning closer, "this is their home turf. They know the rhythm of this city better than we ever will. A single lapse in discipline, a tiny deviation from your routine, and you will be neutralized. In this environment, there is no margin for error. One mistake is all it takes to end your career and your freedom." The following morning, Jack Morrison officially assumed his role at the local cultural center. His primary task was instructing young Soviets in the intricacies of the English language. His classroom was a diverse mix of students, some were genuinely eager to learn, while others were almost certainly observers sent by the state to report on his activities. In the classroom, Jack was the epitome of a dedicated, harmless academic. He focused on American idioms, the structure of formal prose, and the nuances of cultural exchange. He was consistently friendly but maintained a strict professional distance. He never engaged in political debate and never uttered a single word of criticism against the state. After his lectures, students would frequently linger in the hallway, attempting to draw him into more personal or controversial discussions. Jack navigated these interactions with practiced ease, remaining appropriate and neutral. Yet, even as he spoke, he was observing them. He was looking for the subtle signs of a potential recruit. In the complex world of human intelligence, recruitment is a delicate psychological craft. You cannot simply approach a stranger and request a betrayal. You must first map their internal landscape, identifying their hidden frustrations and deep-seated motivations. You have to understand why a person would risk everything to help a foreign power. Jack was trained to categorize these motivations into 4 primary drivers. The first was ideology, individuals who genuinely believed the communist experiment was a failure. The second was financial necessity, those drowning in debt or harboring expensive tastes that their meager Soviet salaries could never hope to satisfy. The third driver was ego. There were many talented people who felt neglected by the state and harbored a desperate need to feel significant, to believe they were playing a pivotal role in the hidden gears of history. They wanted to be recognized as important actors in a global drama, even if their contribution remained entirely secret. Finally, there was the motivation of revenge. These were the most common and often the most productive sources. They were the brilliant professionals who had been passed over for promotions in favor of mediocre colleagues with better political connections. They were bitter, angry at the unfairness of the system, and looking for a way to strike back. Jack developed a keen eye for these psychological cracks. He listened for the student who complained about the pervasive corruption in the housing office or the researcher who hinted at the stifling weight of bureaucracy. These were the first flickers of opportunity, but he knew that identifying a candidate was only the first stage of a long game. The actual approach was the most perilous phase of the operation. If he moved too quickly, he risked being reported to the authorities. If he was too hesitant, the opportunity might vanish forever. He had to build a foundation of genuine trust over many months, ensuring that the target felt safe enough to share their first dangerous secret. 3 months into his mission, Jack finally identified his first serious prospect. Dmitri was a physicist in his mid-30s who worked at a high-level research institute. He was a regular in Jack's advanced English seminar, and it was clear that he was both brilliant and deeply disillusioned with the trajectory of his professional life. Jack could sense the underlying bitterness in the way Dmitri spoke about his work. During one evening session, Dmitri took the risk of asking Jack if they could meet for coffee outside of the center. They chose a busy cafe near the university, a public space where the noise of other patrons provided a natural shield against directed microphones. Over the course of several weeks, their meetings became a regular occurrence. They avoided sensitive topics, discussing instead their shared love for classical music and literature. Jack listened with genuine empathy as Dmitri described being bypassed for a senior position that was given to a less talented man with superior party affiliations. Jack responded by sharing his own stories of academic unfairness, slowly building a rapport based on shared frustration. To any observer, they were just 2 intellectuals discussing the tragedies of the human condition. But beneath the surface, Jack was meticulously laying the groundwork for a partnership that would eventually pierce the Iron Curtain. As the brutal winter finally began to thaw, Jack and Dmitri took a slow stroll through Gorky Park. Beneath the budding trees, Jack spoke carefully about a future where a man's talent was valued more than his political loyalty. He suggested that they could help their respective nations find common ground through a discreet exchange of ideas. Dmitri stopped walking, his expression unreadable as he studied Jack's face. The air between them was heavy with the unspoken threat of a Siberian labor camp. Dmitri understood exactly what was being proposed. Instead of calling for the police, he asked a single, whispered question: "What kind of ideas do you mean?" With that question, Jack Morrison had secured his first window into the Soviet scientific heart. However, the recruitment was merely the opening act. The real danger lay in the logistics of the intelligence flow. They couldn't be seen together too often, as the KGB's shadow was long and their patience was legendary. Jack began training Dmitri in the silent language of tradecraft. They relied heavily on dead drops, prearranged, hidden locations where information could be exchanged without a face-to-face meeting. This allowed them to operate independently, minimizing the risk that a single surveillance team could catch them in the act. The vast, wooded expanses of Izmailovsky Park became their primary theater of operations. Dmitri would conceal film canisters containing photographed documents under specific benches or within the hollows of ancient trees. Jack would retrieve them hours later, his movements perfectly synchronized with the city's morning routine. To camouflage his activities, Jack maintained the persona of a dedicated fitness enthusiast. He jogged every single morning, regardless of the weather or his physical health. He alternated his routes with mathematical precision, ensuring that his presence in various parks across the city seemed entirely random and habitual. He never allowed himself to become comfortable. He knew that in the world of espionage, complacency was a death sentence. Even during his most routine runs, he was constantly scanning the environment, checking reflections in shop windows and monitoring the cars that idled a bit too long at the intersections. Communicating with the CIA headquarters in Langley required even more ingenuity. While the embassy had secure channels, overusing them invited electronic scrutiny. Jack utilized a sophisticated blend of methods, including diplomatic pouches, messages written in invisible ink, and the help of trusted American visitors. The information Dmitri provided was of immense value to the analysts in Virginia. It detailed the inner workings of Soviet weapons research and provided the names of key scientists. But Jack knew that a single source was a fragile lifeline. To truly understand the adversary, he needed to expand his secret network. Over the next year and a half, Jack meticulously recruited 3 additional sources. There was Irina, a high-level secretary who could see the cables moving through the foreign ministry. There was Victor, an officer in the army, and Natasha, who worked at a publishing house used as a front for secret police activities. Each new agent was brought into the fold with the same excruciating patience. Jack would spend months establishing a genuine emotional bond before ever mentioning the word intelligence. He needed to be certain of their motivations and their ability to keep a secret under the immense pressure of the Soviet state. By his 3rd year, Jack's network was producing a steady stream of high-grade intelligence. But his very success increased the probability of a catastrophe. The more data he collected, the more he had to move through the city, and the more opportunities the KGB had to notice a pattern in his boring life. The closest he ever came to being caught occurred in Sokolniki Park. He was retrieving a canister from a hollow tree, convinced he had successfully lost any shadow. As his fingers closed around the film, a voice drifted through the cold air from directly behind him. "It is a truly interesting tree, isn't it?" Jack's heart felt as though it had stopped beating, but his face remained a mask of calm curiosity. He turned slowly to find a man in a gray wool coat watching him. Jack responded in flawless Russian, engaging the stranger in a brief, academic discussion about the local flora, pretending to be a simple nature lover. The stranger mentioned he had seen Jack jogging there before, a subtle, chilling admission that he was being monitored. It was a clear message from the center: "We know you are here." Jack didn't change his route or show a hint of panic. He finished his conversation, completed his run, and only let the fear hit him later. Upon reporting the incident to Richard Carter, the decision was made to go black. Jack ceased all operational activity for 60 days. He became the most unremarkable man in Moscow, focusing entirely on his English classes and cultural lectures. He waited for the KGB to grow bored and shift their resources elsewhere. The 4th year brought a different kind of crisis when Victor suddenly stopped communicating. Jack spent weeks in a state of high anxiety, fearing that his entire network had been compromised. He eventually learned that Victor hadn't been arrested, he had simply been transferred to a remote military post in Siberia. To fill the gap in military intelligence, Jack identified a new target: Colonel Alexei. He was a brilliant, worldly officer who had grown disgusted with the corruption of his superiors. They bonded over a shared love for Western philosophy and cinema, building a friendship that transcended the typical handler-source relationship. Alexei didn't want money, he wanted to make a genuine difference. He believed that the only way to save his country from its own leaders was to provide the West with the information needed to prevent a miscalculation. Under Jack's guidance, the colonel began providing the most sensitive military secrets of the decade. By the 5th year of his mission, the atmosphere in the Soviet capital became suffocating. The KGB launched an unprecedented counterintelligence offensive, determined to purge the city of Western influence. They flooded the streets with extra agents and planted sophisticated honeypots, fake secrets designed to lure intelligence officers into a trap. One particularly cunning trap involved the leakage of fabricated blueprints for a non-existent orbital defense system. The center watched every diplomatic movement with renewed intensity, waiting for a single slip-up. Jack's handler, Carter, issued a global warning to all operatives: trust nothing. Assume every signal is a lure and every secret is a lie. Jack's response was a masterclass in survival. He immediately severed all physical and electronic ties with his network. For 3 long months, he vanished into his role as a dull cultural attaché. He spent his evenings reading Turgenev and attending the ballet, becoming a man so uninteresting that even the most dedicated surveillance teams eventually looked away. The storm eventually broke, and the KGB's grand sweep yielded only minor results. Jack had survived because he understood that in Moscow, doing nothing was often the most dangerous and effective action a spy could take. It required a level of psychological fortitude that few possessed, to watch the information flow stop and simply wait for the clouds to part. In his 6th year, the call finally came from the agency headquarters in Langley. Jack Morrison was being recalled. His tour of duty was over. The news was met with a heavy mix of profound relief and unexpected sorrow. He had lived this secret life for so long that his cover felt more authentic than the identity he had left behind in Virginia. The final weeks were a delicate transition of power. He had to pass his carefully cultivated sources to new CIA handlers, a process fraught with the risk of exposing his agents to fresh eyes. He met Dmitri one last time in the cold shadows of a park. Their farewell was silent and heavy, a recognition that they were 2 men who had changed history together. As his car sped toward Sheremetyevo Airport on his final morning, Jack watched the gray, industrial skyline of Moscow recede. The black Volga followed him to the terminal doors, a silent witness to his departure. He walked through the final security checkpoint, his face a mask of calm, knowing he was leaving behind a legacy of invisible success. During the flight, he reflected on the core pillars of his survival. It wasn't luck that kept him alive, it was the brutal discipline to never break character, even in sleep. It was a healthy paranoia, the constant, exhausting habit of questioning every shadow. And most importantly, it was a deep respect for the professionalism of his KGB adversaries. Years later, after the Iron Curtain had finally crumbled and the Soviet Union became a memory, Jack's sources began to find their way to the West. Dmitri moved to the United States and built a quiet life as a professor. One evening, he received a phone call from an old friend, leading to a long-overdue dinner at a quiet restaurant in Washington, D.C. They sat across from each other, gray-haired and weary but bonded by their shared secrets. Dmitri asked if the constant fear and the risk had been worth the sacrifice. Jack thought of the reports that had informed the decisions of presidents and prevented nuclear escalations. Yes, he replied softly. We provided the truth when the world was blinded by ideology. Jack Morrison was never his real name, that remains a secret protected by the highest levels of national security. To the specialists at Langley, he is simply remembered as the ghost of Moscow, the man who operated in the heart of the enemy for 6 years without a single scratch. His story is a testament to the quiet, human power of patience and discipline. Behind the dramatic myths of cinema, real intelligence is a slow and deeply human craft. It is built on trust, observed in the shadows, and measured in the lives saved by silence. Jack Morrison's mission ended decades ago, but the invisible network he built helped shape the world we live in today, a silent victory won by a man who knew how to be invisible.